Oh, you dodged me, aren't you fancy? Oh, I live! I fucking blocked his whale!
Rain outlines your fate. Huh? Witness the power of Guwa.
Fucking lived through his whale with 1,165 health left because I parried it. Hey everyone, it's Jinx, and I'm a Genshin Impact math guy now. So I do apologize about the lack of videos I was able to work on last week. Basically, my entire week was dedicated to not only clearing the new content on both of my accounts, but also testing out Childe and Diona in various different comps, including in the Abyss 9 through 12. Speaking of which, you will already know this if you follow me on Twitter, which you should probably do because it's where I post my most frequent updates about various different things, as well as the testing I'm doing and results and just my thoughts on things in Genshin. But I did manage to clear Abyss 12-3 with extremely under-geared and under-leveled teams. Now, it did take me 5 hours of resetting to finally get the 12-3 clear because the ice cages and various things in 12-3 would just one-shot my supports. But the point is that it is doable, and I did get a 4-star clear with 2 level 70 kind of stacked artifact-wise carries, as well as level 60 supports with around 7, 8, maybe 1 900 attack. And then 1 level 40 Chongyun support with under 200 attack because he existed to press E. Now, moving forward in the future, I am going to be leveling up my teams a little bit more, making them a bit stronger because I don't feel like spending 7 to 8 hours trying to clear Abyss 12 every single time the rotation comes around. But the point of this entire experiment was for me to see, is it possible to clear Abyss 12 with decent amount of stars on the clear, with very under-leveled, under-geared, under-invested characters and teams, assuming that my team comps are solid enough and that I am using the correct characters to match the floor contents? And the answer to that is a resounding yes. I am planning on putting together a video talking exactly about that and talking about why I still consider things like tier lists very important if you want to tackle the hardest endgame content relatively early with relatively low investments. Like I always say, play the game how you want and use the teams you want to use. I use completely different teams from my Abyss teams in the overall because they're more fun to use. I love using Beidou switch parry support, but she's just not very good in the Abyss. It is incredibly hard to fit Electro units into your Abyss teams when you have to be countering elemental shields on top of abusing leyline disorders. Even in Abyss 11, where Electro damage is boosted, it's still hard to fit her into my team comms when I have better options to match the floor content. The TLDR of the video I'm going to be working on covering this Abyss clear and talking about why I still think tier lists are important if you want to tackle late game content is that, simply put, not all characters are currently made equal. The reason why I was able to clear Abyss 12 with such heavily under-invested teams is because I was making my team compositions not only have massive amounts of synergy and also designed to counter the leyline disorders of each floor, but simply put, I was using the god tier characters that also did all of that got massive amounts of output for the low amount of investment I had to put into them. And keep in mind, god tier doesn't mean 5 stars. My exclusively 4-star team actually had an easier time than my 5-star team did in Abyss 12-3. Alright, now that that aside is over, let's actually talk about how I feel about Childe and Diona after 1 week of playing around with them and testing stuff. Relatively low amount of actual math in this video because we're still crunching all the math on his various team comps, on how strong he actually is, etc., and I don't want to give you any incomplete information on that. However, versus the last video I did about this topic after I had only done a day of testing on Childe and Diona, I have learned a lot more. So first off, between my testing as well as discussing various things with various theory crafters who are focused on Childe right now, speaking of which, a big shout out over to Ben over the Keqing Main's Discord server. He has already compiled a lot of the testing data into a theory crafting library for Childe, link in the description to that. It is very apparent that Childe's upper potential DPS in terms of his teams built around him are definitely at god tier level. This means even accounting for his downtimes and various other things that do hurt his kit in terms of his team compositions, at the top level he is competing with characters like Diluc, Klee, Keqing, and Razor for output in terms of how much damage his teams can actually do. However, before you start going to pull for him with your free-to-play polls, I do want to mention he does have some downsides you have to be aware of. Now, some of these downsides will very easily be fixed in the next few weeks or months as more content comes out. For example, his his artifacts right now are kinda scuffed because we don't have a good set for him. However, there will be a Hydro set eventually. And yes, I have seen the leaks on the new Hydro set, and yes, they will be perfectly tailor-made for a child. However, take those with giant grains of rock salt because, again, leaks. Now, aside from him just having very scuffed artifact sets right now, and again, that will be fixed in the future, his other big issue that will, again, most likely be fixed in the future is just that he's a Hydro character. See, the late game Abyss is really the only really difficult content that you need to be squeezing out and maximizing all the damage you can for. It is the final test that tests how well your teams are built, how well you play, and how wise your investments into your characters truly are. And currently, that content is just massively biased towards Pyro characters. On both floor 9 and 12, you are getting 75% more Pyro damage on those floors because of Leyline Disorders. On top of that, in 11 and 12, the two hardest floors, basically everything is Cryo type, so you get free melts. No matter how well invested your child is, he cannot compete with a Xiangling, Bennett, Diluc, or Klee of the same investment level in that content. Now, child is very nice for Abyss floor 10 because everything on that floor is actually very pyro resistant or immune. However, the unfortunate reality is if you're running pyro focused teams on floor 10 and you cannot brute force your way through to a clear on that, you have no hope of clearing Abyss floor 12. The difference in difficulty is that big. If you have teams that are capable of clearing 12-3, they can just brute force through 9 and 12 no problem. So simply put, in the current hardest endgame content, Child just doesn't have a place because he's not pyro type. Really, the only non-pyro character as a carry that does compete with all the pyros in terms of late game Abyss is Razor. Floor 11 rewards superconductor teams very well, and Razor is the best superconductor carry. And floor 12 is pretty much all cryo units, so you still get free superconductors constantly. And most importantly, Razor can cleanse the condensed ice off of himself with his ultimates. For those of you who don't know, Abyss 12 is a nightmare largely because it has condensed ice, meaning that if you do not have a way to cleanse it off of your team or off of your carry, you have twice as much stamina consumption and like half as much stamina regen. So you either need to run a cleanse on both teams or you need to be really good at stamina management. I will again talk about this in a future video talking about the 4 stars I consider better than most of the 5 stars in the game, but the 2 best non-5 star carries for late game Abyss in my opinion are Razor and Bennett. In fact, my 4-star Bennett team in Abyss 12 had an easier time than my 5-star primary team did. But yeah, sorry, rambly tangent, I kinda do that on these unscripted videos. But moving forward, yes, Child is just currently gimped because Hydro isn't very good in the late game content, but that will likely change in the future when more late game content gets added. So now, let's talk about the issues with Child you need to be aware of if you decide you want to pull for him and build teams around him that will not get fixed in the future most likely. So all of these issues and nuances kind of revolve around one core thing. He is not a true hyper carry character. See, characters like Klee, Diluc, Keqing, Razor, Bennett, as well as Chong Yun and even Xiangling with Crescent Pike. These are all top tier carries in your comp because they are simply put hyper carries. You can focus the majority of your resources into getting the maxed out weapons, maxed out talents, and very, very stacked artifact sets most importantly. And then you can build relatively cheap, relatively low investment supports around them to buff up their damage. And then you get very high output teams with relatively low overall investment. This is exactly what I did for my Abyss 12 clears, with my Diluc and Bennett being the hyper carries for each team. Again, on average, my supports had around 800 attack each. This is what my general philosophy for building cheap deeps teams is, because this is how you get the most damage for the lowest amount of investment per team. And yes, I do have that masterclass talking about this method and talking about how to build team comps and team comp synergies coming later this week. But see, the reason that these hyper carries are able to be hyper carries is because they are what I call a gap filler. See, the only time that these other supports need to be on field is when you're popping their abilities for your team. Generally speaking, you're aiming to pop their E and their Qs off of cooldown. But anytime you are waiting for these cooldowns to come up, anytime you are waiting for these ults to come up, you are gap filling with your carry's basic attack damage, which is stacked to be very high. Because they are filling in all of these gaps between your cooldowns with very high damage basic attacks, you are not losing much DPS even while waiting for the abilities to come up for all of your teammates. The issue with Child is that he doesn't do this. In fact, the opposite is true. Child needs high damage support to gap fill for him while he's waiting for his melee form to come back up. This means that you do need to invest in your other characters a bit more heavily so that this gap-filled damage doesn't tank your overall team DPS too much. This does mean that when you have stacked teams, so your supports are all built up, your Childe is built up, and you stay in Childe's melee form for roughly around 6 seconds is the level we're looking at being most optimal right now. More testing is needed though. But basically, your supports can gap fill the time you're waiting for Childe's melee form to come up for the next 6 seconds of huge burst damage, and the team's damage potential is incredibly high. Again, we're still doing the math and figuring out how high this potential is, but it's looking to be at least at the similar level of having someone like a Diluc, Klee, or Keqing or Razor carry for your team's outputs. However, this does lead into the first issue with Childe as a non-hyper carry slot character, which is that his teams are just more expensive to make work right. If you have fully stacked teams where everyone has their maxed out talents, they have really good leveled up artifacts, and you have a very maxed out end game team, Childe is looking like he will at least compete with, if not beat out, some of the better comps in the game right now. Although, again, we're talking about just total output, we're ignoring the whole thing that Pyro is 75% stronger in the late game Abyss, because again, that will go away eventually. However, those kinds of teams are incredibly expensive to build. Those teams are pretty much Hyper Whale exclusives right now because the game is simply too young and we have not had enough resources for free-to-play players to really build those kinds of teams. His teams just get so expensive, but their max potential is possibly best in the game. Again, I say possibly because we still need to do more calculations on comparing total team outputs. And again, in the context of the current hardest content in the game, Late Abyss, this still doesn't even hold true because Pyro teams are just 75% stronger. See, the issue with a Childe team that is not a super expensive, super heavily invested team is that during the downtime you have when Childe is not in his melee stance and your lower investment, lower damage supports are doing their combo rotations and popping out all this stuff to gap fill time, your DPS tanks because your supports just simply aren't putting out enough damage because they don't have enough investments. Compare this to a similar low investment team with a true hyper carry instead, and when the hyper carry is gap filling with their very high damage basic attacks, you are not tanking your DPS nearly as much during those gap fill times. So yeah, Childe, just like in the story, is an expensive rich ass bitch. Now you may be asking, but wait, what if we run 2 carries instead, so someone like say a Bennett carry can carry while Childe is on cooldown? So yes, this does work, but the issue with that is A, it's still expensive because you have to build up 2 carries for 1 team. But the bigger issue with that is I still am not actually sure if that is actually better than just running the other hyper carry with another support instead of Childe. So again, this is all theoretical because we do need to do more calculations to really see if this is the case or not. But the issue with running a double carry setup with Childe and another carry like Bennett is you do not have overlapping DPS. See, when Childe is on the field and doing his massive burst DPS in melee form, that is going to probably be higher than anything Bennett can put out in that same period of time. The problem is, even though that DPS is higher, you are not overlapping your DPS, you're replacing Bennett's DPS. And if you were to instead have some kind of either burst or transferable support unit instead of Childe in that team comp, you theoretically may get higher team DPS running it that way. Now, I really want to make sure you understand what I mean when I say this lack of overlapping DPS, so let's run a demonstration thought experiment with just some hypothetical numbers. So let's just say while on the field in melee form, Childe is going to be dealing about 400 DPS. And yes, he's going to be doing several times that, but these are purely theoretical numbers for the sake of demonstration. Now let's say that the second carry in the team is a Bennett. And let's just say that his DPS in ult is about 300, and the Bennett should be ulting off cooldown anytime he's on field in the comp that's well built. Now, assuming Childe is doing 6 seconds of melee form, this means he has 12 seconds of cooldown, so he has a 6 out of 18 seconds uptime of 33%. We'll just say, for the sake of argument, that these supports provide about 100 DPS when they pop these abilities in the combination of the reactions, the actual burst damage they deal, the transferable skills, etc. This is actually a really low number, but we are assuming these are relatively low investment supports. Now, this puts the total DPS Childe and Bennett each add into the team at 133.33 as well as 140. This means our total DPS output for the team is going to be 473.33 over these 18 seconds. Now, let's say we replace Childe in this team composition with, say, a Xingqiu, a Mona, a Beidou, a Fischl, anyone who is a better burst support than he is for cheap. Now, this means because Bennett is able to be on the field for 70% of the time, and yes, he is still ulting off cooldown because a well-built team around Bennett does do that, he is now outputting 210 DPS for the team. This puts our total DPS for the Bennett team without a child in it and just 3 proper burst supports at 510. And mind you, Team 2 is much cheaper to build than Team 1 because you don't have to stack 2 carry characters in terms of artifacts, weapons, talents, etc. Now, the reason why this is so much higher is because Childe and Bennett do not overlap their DPS uptime, but burst supports do overlap their DPS uptime with the main carry. When Jing Cho or a Beidou or official press their buttons, they add this damage to the team. While on the other hand, Childe replaces the DPS of the other carry, which can lead to damage losses in terms of total DPS. In this, again, purely theoretical demonstrative model, the new support only has to deal 63.33 DPS over this 18 seconds to match the damage of the double carry setup. This is the problem with these double carry setups. Instead of building teams that overlap their DPS on top of each other to increase your total team DPS, you are replacing the DPS of each of the different carries with each other's slightly higher burst DPS. Well, okay, what happens if we instead run 3 relatively cheap supports with Childe instead? This is where his lack of being a true hyper carry comes into play, because over half of his time has to be spent in his much weaker bow form. Now, this extra time in bow form does drop him below the other carries' consistent DPS output, but we don't actually know by how much, so let's just say theoretically it drops to 270. This drops him to 10% lower than the other carries can deal, which is frankly being generous. This does result in him being simply weaker compared to the other hyper carries in the game who gap fill with more consistent higher DPS. Again, please take these numbers with massive grains of salt. These are not real numbers. This is for the point of demonstrating the issues with double carry setups and the issues with Childe's DPS uptime in his melee form. Do not take these numbers seriously, and please do not quote them to anyone, because again, this is purely theoretical for the sake of demonstration. In fact, the values I show probably aren't even close to the actual ratio shown, because 400 over 300 DPS is actually a 33% higher DPS, which is probably unrealistic for even melee Childe to hit compared to like a Diluc, Klee, Keqing, Bennett, etc. But yeah, this is the issue with double carry setups, is the lack of overlapping DPS versus teams that are better built towards supporting one hyper carry in the team, and Childe just is not as good a hyper carry unless his supports deal enough DPS. But if his supports start dealing more DPS, that means we have to increase investment in them, again making his teams just simply more expensive to compete. However, this does mean that the potential output can be very high for these teams if his gap fill is strong enough. But yeah, that's pretty much my impressions of Childe. Again, this stuff is all theoretical. We are still doing so many calculations to really figure out where his potential is, where he actually looks as a hyper carry who has to be in bow form sometimes, etc. But my opinion, underline opinion, is that he simply has more expensive teams to compete with the other hyper carries in the game. Again, once we do some more total damage calculations for different team compositions and really figure out the best way to utilize Childe, I may be wrong and he may actually be able to compete with other hyper carries for relatively cheap support teams. But this is my current impression of him after about a week of testing him. So again, everything grain of salt, these are just my opinions. The demonstration was not real numbers, it was just to show the issues double carry setups have relative to single carry setups. And now let's talk about very briefly Diona, because there's not much to say about her. So Diona is kind of a weird jack of all trades healer character because she has decent burst damage with sacrificial bow, but it's not the highest for a burst support. She is also pretty low healing output with her ult because of the low tick rate, but it is still a heal. And because of the low tick rate, she's not very good at cryo application consistently for like a superconductor team, although she can work with Razor specifically for that if you just fight inside of her ult. But honestly, for a cryo applicator for a superconduct team or a freeze team, you're better off with Kaya. However, she does also have a shield, which is very nice and cozy, especially on a Razor team, because you give Razor a juicy shield so he can unga bunga harder. Overall, I still prefer Chi-Chi over her if you have a Chi-Chi as a healer option for any cryo teams, which is not particularly surprising because Chi-Chi is a 5-star healer. However, Diona is specifically very cozy for Abyss 12. Now you may be thinking, what? Abyss 12? But basically everything on there is either immune or resistant to cryo damage, and she deals exclusively cryo. Well, there's really 2 big reasons why she's so cozy for Abyss 12. First off is because 12-3 is the hardest content in the game, and there are Thunder Fatuis on both halves, so you ideally want to have a cryo unit on both teams. With Sacrificial Bow especially, Diona is very fast at breaking the Thunder Fatui shields, and they have so much health you can't really stop them from popping shields several times that you have to break. Now, technically, if you're really good at using Anemo characters to swirl, you don't actually need any cryo units for 12-3 because the Anemo characters can simply swirl cryo from the other Fatuis on the field into the Thunder Fatuis, but that's really mechanically hard to do versus just bringing cryo units. The second reason why she's so goddamn cozy is because Diona has a cryo-resistant shield. And basically everything in the first 2 floors for 12 deal cryo damage, so it makes you significantly tankier. On top of that, there are ice cages as well as icicles falling from the sky and just so much cryo damage coming onto your team that feels very hard to dodge in the extended periods of fighting time you have in the Abyss. Having a cryo-resistant shield you can pop almost off of cooldown with very high uptime is super cozy, because I don't know about you, but I am really bad at dodging those ice cages. But yeah, at the end of the day, she's still technically a healer, and she does look to be a very good healer for a lot of Razor compositions if you run a Razor carry. I wouldn't really call her a top tier healer slot character, especially when Chi-Chi and Bennett exist in this game, but she's still a healer, and she's a hell of a lot better than Barbara at least. Alright, that's all I got for you on this one. This again turned out to be quite a long video of me just ranting about my first impressions of the new characters in this first week of testing. As always, thank you so much for checking out the video. If you learned something new and you enjoy the content, be sure to like the video, comment, and share it with your friends. All of these things do push it up in the SEO in the search engine so more people get to see it. And be sure to check out Tuner over at twitch.tv/TunerTaka if you want almost daily streams of Genshin Impact. Tuner and I are channel partners and we do revenue share, so any Twitch primes, any subs, even just any follows do help out both of us a lot. And if you want the most up-to-date information about the channel or just stuff I'm working on, be sure to check out our Twitters. The @JinxMathlos is my Twitter and the @JinxTuner is the company account run by Tuner. And if you have any questions or would like to chat or hang out with some cool people or find people to multiplayer with, then be sure to check out our Discord server, the Mathlos Nest. We have a beautiful community of very helpful people there, and the community is constantly growing. And of course, as always, none of this would be possible without the generosity of our patrons. I say this every single video, but I will continue to say it. Y'all the best. Alright, this is it for this video. As always, be sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell if you want to see the new content as soon as it comes out. I am going to go work on the masterclass for team comp building now. Happy waifu hunting whalers. We'll see you in the next one. Bye.